Hello and welcome to our webcast today. My name is Ulf Madsen and I just left TokenX and it's focusing more on data privacy now. So today we have a global audience and I will discuss global aspects during our webinar. So we have seen that several countries are starting to add surveillance and contact tracing to find out the spread of the coronavirus. And in the webinar, we will talk about data privacy aspects of that and what we should be concerned about. So during our webcast, I encourage you to submit questions, type them in. So on the right-hand side of the interface here, you can add your own questions to me. And I think that makes the session more interesting. I love to be able to answer your questions as they come during our webinar. A little bit about my background. I've been Chief Technology Officer at a couple of companies after leaving IBM. I worked as an architect and developer with a focus on databases, application, and security at IBM Research and Development for many years. I've been in the invention industry for a long time. I have 73 awarded US patents. And I've been delivering products and services like data encryption, tokenization, data discovery. I've done security and privacy benchmarking and gap analysis for our major credit card companies or card brands. I worked in managed security services and SOC, Security Operations Center, and I've been developing cloud application security brokers, CASBs, or cloud gateways, and application firewalls, web application firewalls, WAFs. And I started off in robotics and application development. So what we are planning for in the United States is to mobilize an army of people that will help us with tracing contacts to the virus. And these are, so recently in New York City, we have added 1,000, or we're in the process of adding 1,000 people to start that manual side of the tracing. So let's start to talk about surveillance and how that can be carried out and what we have seen in a couple of countries. So as part of smart city technology, we have seen a couple of countries looking at and implementing surveillance technologies. So if we look at Singapore, they are collecting data, and that phone data will be deleted after 21 days. And I think that's an important aspect because we don't want that sensitive privacy data to stay out there. You never know how that will be used in the future after the pandemic and so. So in Singapore, it's using Bluetooth signals, short-range signals, so you can be alerted to people that you have been in a close contact proximity to, and get notified if any of them turns out to be infected after you have had that contact. And in China, individuals had to use this contact tracing app and share the status before accessing public transportation. So at the bottom, we are seeing people talking about the importance of anonymizing data and encrypt the data, so you make it harder to trace the information back to individuals. So let's see, I have a question here. How can we be sure that information will be destroyed? That's always a trust issue, depending on who is collecting the data and how that data is shared. Over time, you may not know how the data will be shared. We'll talk about regulations that are defining how that should be taken care of. But the longer the data is out there, of course, the risk is increasing that data will be shared and not destroyed. So let's come back to that discussion during the presentation. This is from SCE magazine, and in United Kingdom there are plans to implement contact tracing applications. So it's basically an alert that you get if persons that you have spent time closely with, if they are infected, if it's proven that they were affected potentially when you met. So thinking about, for example, the national census that we have annually in the United States, if you have an emergency or there's a situation where information is needed urgently for the safety of you, data will be accessed, sometimes regarding of what the regulation is saying. So we will talk about that later on in the presentation also. So comparing Europe to China and Hong Kong, it's a more conservative approach in Europe. So that discussion is interesting. And you can see at the bottom of the screen, you have a reference, a link where you can find out more details about this source information. This is from the Irish Times, and they are saying that no one will have access to a list of contaminated people. And in the situation here in France, the French app would rely solely on Bluetooth technology that is local to your phone, and it will record people nearby you, phones that are discovered nearby your phone for some extended time. So data will be de-identified and transmitted. So this information can be tracked back and notify you if some of the people, any of the people that you were in proximity of are infected. Apple and Google, they are implementing a toolkit, a technology that will come in a future update of the operating systems for iPhones and Android. And that toolkit is not doing anything. But the toolkit can be utilized by application developers. For example, a local government can implement an application that they ask you to download on your phone if you want to be part of this scheme or this opportunity to get notified. So Apple and Google will not send data anywhere and not trace you, not sell you data in this application. But you should be aware that the application that is manufactured and downloaded from some vendor, maybe from some government development, that application could handle data in a way that you may not like. So be aware how that application that is utilizing the Apple and Google operating system features, how that application is handling the data. And be aware that those applications are likely to be targeted by criminals. So let me see. Another question, if Bluetooth phone is disabled, would you essentially be opted out of this? Well, it's an interesting question, the opt-out situation. So we need to be aware that there might be an opt-out or there might be an opt-in. They might be default to opt-in. And if you for some reason do not want to be communicated to, do not want to be tracked, your GPS position or any communication, then maybe it's not enough to just turn off your phone. The safest way is always to put your phone in a cage, a Faraday cage, basically a metal box or tin foil, for example, that will prevent your phone from communicating. So if you are paranoid, you should put your phone, when you're not using it, in a tin foil bag. So what about privacy in this situation? So this is from Guy Pearce that is saying that this can actually be a concern and impact civil liberties. And you don't know what will happen after the months that the corona activity hopefully is taken care of and over with. So the bottom line is that don't forget privacy when you start to share information, sensitive information about yourself. So another question here, these tracking methods are completely self-reported data. Methods are in place to ensure correct information is collected. That's an interesting question. Let me come back to that because we have some comments about that during in the material here. This is from the Wall Street Journal about potentially eroding privacy. So we know that European nations monitor citizens' movement by tapping into telecommunications data. So basically when you connect to your cell phone to a cell tower, nearby cell tower, they know that you are actually present in that area. And we know that GPS location tracking is more granular, and some organizations are collecting that data from your phone. It looks like they are focusing on de-identifying data, anonymizing data. So in case the data is disclosed, sold, or hacked into, at least you know that there's some level of de-identifying individuals, some prevention, some protection against de-identifying. So that there are ways to do it. We know that some companies like Google and Apple are using techniques like differential privacy and k-anonymity. So differential privacy basically delete the detailed records about individuals and only store aggregated data when more information is gathered, so they actually can start to aggregate. And k-anonymity is another technique that is preventing groups smaller than k to be identified. So if you say that k should be 7, so 7 anonymity, then the database cannot identify groups that are smaller than 7 individuals. And there are other techniques that you can use to de-identify data to limit the risk of re-identifying data when data, for example, is matched between different databases. And I think it's becoming more and more important to look at the increasing risk of linking data between databases. More and more information is out there. Access to more databases can provide linking between different databases that were not anticipated in the beginning when you collected the data. So de-identification is not a one-time effort. You need to, for example, annually revisit and see what is the risk of linking or data inference between different databases that are available out there, publicly available out there, and then adjust how you de-identify the data. And you may want to clean out the data, so you put stringent techniques in place for de-identification in the data you have. So we are seeing different approaches. We talked about Bluetooth, and it could be in the smartphone or a wristband. And it looks like it will be very seriously enforced in different regions and countries. Would you give up health or location data to return to work? So we want to track the spread of the virus, and we want to be more safe in the workplace and in other settings where we come close to strangers or people that we do not know the status of. And we are going back to how long will the data be held. And my view is that this should be for a limited time. There need to be ways to destroy the encryption keys or destroy the data and kill the data after a while. We saw 21 days were mentioned here, but definitely over the time when you have this activity, you only need the data when you have this situation. And regulations like GDPR in Europe also require that the individual can request the data to be erased. So a question here in this article is, does it work? Does this actually reduce the spread? And I think if you have enough people using it, it can be effective. I've seen research studies talking about different numbers, what level of effect, how effective it is, if you have 40% using it, if you have 50% using it, 60%, 80%. So it needs to be a population that where many people are using phones that actually can host an application like this. And it needs to be a certain level. So let's say that it needs to be in a population of 80% that actually have phones capable of running this, downloading and running this type of application. And there might be 40% that volunteer to this program to make it effective. But you can go and look at those numbers, because it's interesting to when you assess if this will be effective. So we talked about the operating system. So when Apple and Google will upgrade, they are planning to include the toolkit that enables this. And potentially it will be on by default. And then you need an application, as I mentioned, that is utilizing these operating system functions. So the application will actually collect the data and make use of that data. Privacy experts say responsible coronavirus surveillance is possible. And we talked about privacy aspects, strong privacy safeguards, and there are international standards that we will talk about in a minute that can define how you should protect the privacy of the data, depending on the scenario, attack scenario, what you want to prevent, linkage, inference, and other issues with re-identifying data and identifying individuals. This is an interesting project from the University MIT. So they are developing a privacy-preserving app that is tracing, similar to the Apple-Google initiative. And it's a balance. You need to still be compliant. We'll talk about how compliance rules are affected by this pandemic in a minute. And there are ways to preserve your privacy even though sensitive data is gathered. The good thing about the Google and Apple initiative is that this is open source. And I have seen several experts looking at the code to verify that there are no backdoors. This code from Apple and Google is not leaking privacy sensitive information. It's not collecting, for example, your MAC address, your name, and other identifying information. So what can you do? So let's talk about your sensitive data and how you actually can take care of it. This is information from the Federal Trade Commission, FTC in United States. They collected data about credit card attacks, misuse of PII data or personal data, identity theft over the years. And I think the trend is alarming. This is just getting worse. The FBI recently said that crime, cybercrime, is on the rise, a steep increase during this pandemic situation. And attackers across the world have targeted different, even hospitals and research projects that are trying to help us. So that's, I think, a very dark side of this criminality, that they are going after hospitals and people that try to help us in this situation. This is an example of what you may get from a criminal. They may send you a USB, send you some software that can help you with different things. They may send you a gift card to attract you to plug in this USB or software into your laptop. And that's the way they introduce their malware to attack you and steal various type of data from you. So be aware. The most common fraud is via email. So you have these phishing, spear phishing, where people are targeted in emails to click on a link or download an attachment, a PDF or doc that will introduce malware and viruses into your computer. So fraudulent emails are clearly dominating in this situation. So always look at where this email is coming from. Is it really from an employee, or is it someone that is trying to impersonate an employee, maybe an executive in an organization? Look at the link. Is this actually a credible source? Is the link misspelled, but looks like it's a trustworthy source? What I usually go is to the source. So I like to type in the name of the website, type in the link on my own, and go to the source, and then find out the information that the email may suggest that I just click to get. So go to the source and evaluate that this is not an attacker that is trying to get you. Who do you trust? We know that your sensitive data is collected by many organizations. And if you don't pay for the service, you are probably the product. It's probably you that they are selling to run their business. They are selling your data. And what can we do about this? So let's talk a little bit about the control of your personal data. Who can you trust? So this is one source that looked at companies that are that people trust with your personal data. So on the left-hand side, you have some top performers, and on the right-hand side, you can see the worst performance in this rating. What about regulations? So we have seen that Europe, they started pretty early. For example, Germany, they started with privacy legislation in 1970, Sweden in 1974, and it was basically prompted from issues during the wartime in Europe, where people started to get concerned about how government collected and misused data. And then we had GDPR coming out recently. So I think it started a little bit in January last year. So we're starting to get some experience from enforcement and fines, auditing based on GDPR. And GDPR is basically modeled as the legislation, early privacy legislation in countries like Germany and Sweden, Austria also, for example. And we more recently had the California CCPA that is a little bit similar to the GDPR. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And you can see that many countries are tightening up the privacy requirements. So we'll talk about some of these. Regulatory risk is becoming more and more an issue. And legislation is coming over us more rapidly for each year. And if we look at, for example, North America, there are more than a handful of laws in information security, health privacy, financial privacy, education privacy, breach regulations, breach notification regulations, and others that will be go into effect. 80 new laws in these different regions during 2019. So how do you handle a situation where you do business or handle sensitive information from different regions? This is a study that is coming from IAPP. So they are focusing on privacy. It's an Institute for Privacy Professionals. And they are talking about, they are reporting that in different regions, like in US, you can see the yellow numbers. So in US, 37% of the companies, they need to handle between 2 and 5 privacy laws. And organizations in Europe, they are to a larger extent handling those many privacy laws. Up on the left-hand side, you can see the audience that contributed to this survey. So it was mainly US and European and UK companies. It's increasing. So currently 10% are covered, but in a couple of years, 2023, 65% of the world's population will have its personal information covered under these new privacy regulations. So it's coming to stay, and it's just increasing. So what do we do? What do they do when they are hit by privacy regulations? So these are numbers from US and Europe and UK. 80% overall updated the website policy. And you can see further down, you have collected to store data but de-identified it. 25% did that overall. So this is a sample of what actions companies took over the last year. What about all these regulations in the pandemic situation? What about GDPR, CCPA, PCI, DSS, United States Health HIPAA rules? Are they changing? Are they still enforced? So let's talk a little bit about that. So Europe is basically saying that GDPR still applies. You need to ensure the data protection. Of course, they will be busy handling the pandemic, but there's no stepping down of the rules. If you look at GDPR, what should you do? You need to find the data. If you have that data, you need to start with data discovery, and then you need to, for example, encrypt, tokenize, to lock down and control that data. Data discovery can be facilitated by more and more advanced tools in the market. This is an example from BigID that is using advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence to help in finding the sensitive data, to help in tracing the data flow, so you can see how is this sensitive data exchanged between different regions. This information from another company that is talking about the importance of data flow mapping. You need to find the data, and you need to understand how this sensitive data is flowing. And you may not have a good picture. You may have how you think it is. So you need to actually go out and find out the reality. How is this data flowing? And if you don't find out, you can end up in a situation where you breach, where you're not compliant to regulations, and data that you are not aware of might be hacked. You can be fined in these situations for not knowing and not protecting that data. And looking at GDPR, you actually need to know how this data was collected, from where, and for what purpose, and also who can access this sensitive data. So that aspect looks pretty much like regulations from in Germany and Sweden in 1970, 1974. So these are old basic rules that now are stepping up and enforced more widely. What is PII? So this source is saying that PII is any information about an individual. So to be a little bit more specific, this is a list of 10 suggested items on the left-hand side considered to be personally identifiable information. And on the right-hand side, you see a list of 7 types of data that is regarded as linkable data. So we will talk more about this distinction later on. So what this company is saying that they apply field-level data encryption for all the PII fields, the 10 fields that you find on the left-hand side. What is the difference between GDPR and CCPA? They are pretty much the same, but CCPA is broader. PCI is, CCPA in California is not just talking about the issue of identifying an individual. They are talking about and regulating the issue of identifying a household. So that is covered. And the California regulation is a little bit different in fines and other details, but they are rules are more business focused in California. GDPR is more focused on that the individual should control the data. Who can access? Can it be sold? Should it be erased? Then we have the New York regulation in the United States that is looking at all sizes of business. California is only looking at the little bit larger businesses, but in New York it covers all sizes of business. So back to California. California is special, or the CCPA is very special because they are not just targeting PII, identifiable information. They are targeting information that can lead to identifying you. Attributes that in combination can identify you. So that's the issue of data inference. So that's an extremely broad target. What about the pandemic now? They are saying it's still in effect, but they are obviously focusing on more urgent matters in the pandemic situation. CCPA and litigation is starting to be interesting. I don't want to go too deep, but we are seeing what is happening on the litigation side now. Companies, this is again from IAPP, Privacy Professionals Organization, and they are talking about the uncertainty. So they are basically saying that now 79% of organizations are saying that, yeah, they are unsure if CCPA will apply to them. More and more companies are realizing that they are actually covered. Since figures like 12-13% of business globally are affected by the California CCPA. On the right-hand side, you see a sample of techniques, solutions that you can apply to be compliant to the different articles in CCPA that you can find on the left-hand side. So traditional data masking, auditing, and discovery. There's a tool from IAPP that can help you in getting compliant. What about HIPAA? So HIPAA is stepping down a little bit, and they are saying that if you have an emergency situation, you can share without consent. So that's the big thing with HIPAA in the pandemic situation. If you have an emergency situation, you can share the medical data without consent. This is an example about a checklist for compliance, applicable for working at home also, of course. PCI is saying that they are sensitive to the situation. You still need to be compliant, but they are sensitive to the issues, and you should talk to your brand, your bank, your acquirer about the situation you are in. So what can you do? De-identifying the data. There are many different ways. The good thing is that there are standards. For example, from the International Standards Organization, ISO. Just a couple of examples here. This is what data looks like when it's masked. You can see it in the middle. This is what data could look like. This is from 2 other vendors. This is examples from those vendors. This is how different data, age data, can look when you apply generalization techniques, rounding, aggregation, binning, and other techniques. Just a couple of examples from these vendors. Tokenization, an example, an international bank is using tokenization to comply and still be securely sharing sensitive personal data and financial data between countries in Europe. What about purchases? You may not want to be tracked where you did different purchases, and what you actually purchased. So this is an example on the left-hand side at the bottom. You can see de-identified data that will avoid identifying your behavior. And the data can still be used for analysis by a retailer or whoever wants to analyze the data without identifying you. Another vendor are exemplifying high-risk data, medium-risk, and lower-risk data. They are applying different policies to protect that data. Yet another vendor example. This is the international standard that is defining. So the standard is roughly 1 year old, and it's defining different de-identification techniques and different formal privacy measurement models on the right-hand side. So this is good. You can actually apply a technique that will mathematically prove the level of privacy assurance you get with your data by applying this specific technique. So in the middle you can see what Apple and Google are using. So they are using differential privacy to so we need to trust them that they filter out the sensitive, detailed data and only store curated, aggregated data in the long term. Just some examples how a few of these models work. Format preserving encryption on the left, homomorphic encryption at the bottom, and in the middle you have the k-anonymity model with a cleansing operation that I talked about before. And on the right-hand side you can see the differential privacy that these companies, Apple and Google, are using. So some of these models require a protected database, not an open database. And some of the models require that you have a protected service that you can trust, that is delivering the data to you, the result that is privacy protected. Here we have an example of applicability. So you have these techniques that we talked about before. A couple of de-identification techniques on the left, a couple of formal privacy measurement models on the left also. So here we are covering tokenization, crypto, suppression techniques like masking and hashing, differential privacy, and different ways, different models of K anonymity. On the right-hand side, you can see that some of these models only work in a centralized environment. Other models are applicable for a distributed environment. Some models are good in a high-performance data warehouse. And on the right-hand side, you can see if this is something suitable for a public cloud or your own private cloud, or a private cloud that you can control who you are sharing the resources with. Here we have again the different techniques. So I selected, I included noise addition at the bottom, and on the right-hand side we can see what type of protection do you get. Do you actually, is data protected in transit, in use, or in storage? And in the middle you can see typical use cases for these different techniques. Here we are expanding the matrix. So on the right-hand side, we are talking about data truthfulness. You actually keep the truthfulness of each record. And on the right-hand side, is this technique applicable to all kind of attributes? Some techniques are just applicable for direct identifiers and or local identifiers, and a few of the techniques are applicable to all attributes that you have in your data, not just identifiers. So how are we helped by these different techniques on the left-hand side? So on the right-hand side, you can see if they actually are helping us with reducing the risk. And when I talk about reducing the risk, I mentioned before that there's a risk of data inference where you actually can point to an individual by looking at attributes. I may be the only guy with a yellow car on this particular street. So these attributes will identify me. So those are inference attributes. And some of the techniques are helping us to reduce the risk of linking between different data, or reducing the risk of singling out an individual. So you need to be considering your usage, your use case. What do you want to prevent? And then you can pick and choose for, again, among these different protection techniques, privacy techniques. So for each data, each type of data, and each use case, business use case, will help you to decide what type of technique should you be using in each scenario. What about tools and vendors? More and more vendors are coming to the privacy dance. The privacy technology marketplace as reported by IAPP, again, the Privacy Professionals Organization. They're reporting that by 2020, we have 300 plus technologies or vendors in this space. And the different categories, they are doing different things. Some are doing data discovery, like 107 are doing data discovery. You can see it in the middle. And some are doing activity monitoring, 93. So you can see that dark green is by 2019, and the bright green is the addition in 2020. So you can see where the growth is. For example, you can see that assessment manager and data mapping are growth areas. Here we have a handful of vendors. So on the left-hand side, you can see how big are they, many employees in different buckets, and the vendor name, revenue as reported, and on the right-hand side, you can see the sources from U.S. Patent Office, from Forrester and older. So in the middle, you can see the different categories. So green represents de-identification capabilities by these 7 vendors. And Forrester reported that these 5 yellow vendors, they have data in use protection. Then you have other vendors that are doing app-level encryption, data trace encryption, data masking, and format preserving encryption. So this is reported by, the middle section here is reported by Forrester. So you can see the larger companies, they are typically doing app-level encryption, data at rest, and data masking. And then you have the smaller vendors that are typically focused on de-identification, data and use protection. We have 54 vendors that are focusing on de-identification and different ways of de-identification. So you can see this just an alpha list from, again, IAPP. At the end here, I compiled a list of references that I find useful about the different privacy regulations, about data protection standards. You can see the ISO reference in the middle, number 8, and you have some other references that I find useful. And if you want to read one of my latest articles about data security, you can go to number 16. I published that in the ISSA journal in December last year. And if you do not have access to it, just contact me and I can share it with you. So we are running out of time. We have 2 seconds left. Now we are out of time, and I would like to thank you. Thank you for your questions. I have a couple of questions that I do not have time now to answer, but I will post answers on LinkedIn, and I will post my PowerPoint deck, my slide deck on LinkedIn and slide share. So you can go there if you are interested in my slide deck. Thank you very much for attending, and stay safe out there.